Welcome. I'm Michael McDonnell. I am the cybersecurity librarian. This is my co-host, Moro Arakaki. Hello, Moro.
Hello, Michael. Good to see you as always.
So we're talking about SUNBURST and SolarWinds tonight.
Yeah, we are. We are. Hot topic tonight. Well, that's been the hot topic for the last week and then some, right? So it's unfortunate it unfolded, especially during these times. But at the same time, as we were discussing, Michael, there's a lot of disinformation out there, and I felt like this was a good platform to kind of air our grievances as well as explain how we feel and how we see the current situation. So
absolutely. And we've got
Jared.
Sorry, Jared, I muted you just as you unmuted yourself.
Good evening, guys.
Hey, Jared.
Jared is a powerhouse behind the scenes here in our Discord community. And I am so happy that we've got him joining us tonight. He and I have talked a lot about this topic. Jared, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Jared Richardson. I'm the Director of IT Security Compliance for Salu. We're a company in Edmonton, a consulting company, providing IT consulting services as well as security and a bunch of other fun things.
And I like Jared a lot because he, like me, seems to get his fingers in a lot of different pies. It's really challenging, and I like his opinions because of that. Because he doesn't see it just from one perspective. So for our guests at home, we are talking about the recent SolarWinds breach. SolarWinds, and I'm gonna go slow a little bit, but I'm not gonna go into a ton of detail. We are going to do a separate technical YouTube video on our Technical Tuesday segment next week for all the technical stuff, but we're going to start with a little summary here. For those of you not aware, SolarWinds is a company that makes a product called Orion. Orion is a network monitoring system. It'll monitor all your switches, all your servers, all your services, tell you when they're up, measure their performance, perform their backups, and do many, many other remote things. And SolarWinds requires a lot of privilege to work. You've got to give it credentials to log into all of those devices. And those devices that you're monitoring tend to be critical to the business. Monitoring databases that contain the most important data in your company, to your switches, your routers, your firewalls, all of which your most sensitive data pass through. You give them all the credentials it needs to monitor it. There is a tendency in the world for this very complex product to be stood up quickly and often with more privilege than it needs. Bit of a double whammy. Okay, that in itself is an issue. The problem here is that right now what you're seeing in the news is the result of what's called a supply chain attack against SolarWinds Orion, meaning our adversary, some threat actor, compromised SolarWinds so that they could attack all of the customers who have installed SolarWinds Orion. And they did that because, wow, what a thing to compromise. Orion, the thing that has all of your most precious passwords and access to all of your most precious systems. Wow, what if you could compromise all of those? And that's the supply chain attack. They want to attack you and your systems, so they attack your vendor, someone that you depend upon in your supply chain. And there's been many, many consequences of this because the companies that use SolarWinds Orion are some of the biggest companies in the world, most of the Fortune 500, thousands of mid-sized companies, municipalities, governments. Some of the victims, one of them is a legal firm that just one of their clients has $17 billion in investment assets. Not to mention U.S. federal government and governments all over the world, including defense organizations. And that's why it's all over the news. SolarWinds estimates that 18,000 customers have installed the Trojanized version of Orion, though not all of them were victim of this. This got traction because one of the first victims, the one that discovered this, was FireEye. FireEye is one of the world's most well-respected and largest incident response and security companies. They're the type of people that go after nation-state threat actors, the spies, the APTs, and they out them. And the first thing that occurred was related to them. And then they revealed shortly thereafter that many organizations associated with the Department of Homeland Defense had also been breached by this same threat actor. And in those cases, in each case, it was very stealthy and the compromise was complete. That the threat actor had gained complete and very hard to detect access to all aspects of their infrastructure, had compromised their authentication systems, making it very, very hard to uncover. Later tonight, I will talk about why this should be categorized as a high uncertainty incident. That is, it is very difficult to have certainty of whether you are compromised or not, and very difficult once you know whether you're compromised to know how badly compromised you are. And this makes it very different from the devastating extortion attacks that we all suffer through ransomware. Very different from incidents of malware, business email compromise, or funds transfer fraud, or banking trojans. It's very different from those because those are characterized by a high degree of certainty. And the way we tackle them is very different. And right now, our compatriots, our colleagues in IT and cybersecurity all over the world are having to deal with this, not knowing how to deal with high uncertainty events. Okay.
So, Michael, I'm just going to add a couple of comments. So, I think there's a lot of organizations out there, smaller organizations that are probably thinking, well, I don't run Orion, so I'm not affected. But the reality is, you know what? If they don't have their own in-house IT and they're leveraging someone else, like an MSP, right, a managed service provider, chances are that MSP are running Orion. And through that, their network could be compromised or could have been compromised. So I'm not trying to put gasoline on the fire, but I am pointing out the fact that this has far more reaching consequences than just those 18,000 on that list that were detected. So
you're absolutely right. One of the reasons I invited Jared on is because Jared's got a lot to say about the risk associated with MSPs and the RMM tools they use. In digging into who might be compromised, I found ISPs, telcos, managed service providers, and a lot of the victims. It was very clear from the naming conventions and the breach data that it wasn't the client who was breached directly, but it was their managed service provider that was breached. Exactly. Because they're the ones that were running Orion. This, unfortunately, is the gift that we'll keep on giving this Christmas.
That's right.
Because even once those people who are compromised have dealt with it, it's the people who were compromised, whose vendors were compromised. I will get into why we shouldn't overstate this and why being potentially compromised doesn't mean compromised much later. There's a lot of nuance here. Yeah. Okay, Moro, you've gathered some slides up, and I'm going to
Yeah.
show those now.
Okay.
Might be a good time to sort of give a little background on exactly what this is we're talking about and how it worked.
Sure. Well, I
I'm
don't know if
actually,
you would like to, Michael, or if you want me to kind of jump in.
yeah,
Or
please.
okay.
Do you want to start with the timeline or the explanation?
Yeah, you know what? Maybe the timeline slide is probably where we want to go, because, I think some people may not understand that, the level of not just skill here, but level of patience.
Yeah.
And some of the techniques used were at a very, very expert level that they were able to do this. So, I mean, if you look at the timeline, I'm just going to go through this very quickly. You see that actually SolarWinds, so the company that produces this monitoring tool called Orion, they were breached sometime, actually probably even before March. Right now, current estimates based on some of the evidence gathering done by like the Mandiant and whatnot at FireEye, has posited that there's a very high likelihood that they were actually breached even before that, but they were so stealthy and they were making their moves potentially very quietly to introduce this malware, and it does come in the form of a DLL. Now we're going to probably touch on that in that previous slide that Michael had showed earlier, but just following the timeline, we see that sometime around December 8th is when FireEye reported that they had been breached. Essentially, their pen testing tools that they use for their red team had been stolen, and they started to further investigate. And by about December 11th, they started to announce that they had discovered that the way the breach actually happened, the vector, was through a set of corrupted files that they found on the Orion software from SolarWinds. And then they started to work kind of backwards, trying to figure out how far that malware had existed, and that's why we see that timeline actually go all the way starting in March. They were actually able to kind of extrapolate and understand that the breach probably occurred during that time frame. We see Saturday, like literally a week before, the White House has an emergency meeting about all the various government agency breaches. So as Michael had mentioned, it wasn't just even the Defense Department; it was several U.S. government agencies, including the Treasury branch, which is pretty big if you consider having information to basically one of the biggest banks, if not the biggest banks in the world. Excuse me. We see December 13th, the government, U.S. government, actually issues a directive to all agencies that are running SolarWinds Orion to shut it down immediately. We also see that SolarWinds actually releases an advisory, and FireEye discloses its information, as well as Microsoft. And out of all this, I'm going to say, we see it in around Tuesday, December 15th, Microsoft and FireEye actually commandeered the domain that was used in a piece of this attack, essentially activating the kill switch. So, for the God grace of them, thank God this incident could have been probably a lot worse. They were able to actually stop it as quickly as they could after they found out. Then we see that December 17th, Microsoft already found out through its investigations that it found about 40 plus customers that were actually being targeted. And they were saying that the majority of their targets, their customers, were actually MSPs. So as we were talking, managed service providers, the guys that are actually providing IT services to some of the smaller and mid-sized organizations, as well as large organizations too. By Monday, we see a list of growing, I'm going to say, victims, and they include some of the biggest top-name IT companies in the world: Intel, NVIDIA, Cisco, VMware. And then at that point, we actually find out from the U.S. Treasury Department that they've actually had their email accounts compromised. So it's pretty serious when it gets to that point, right? And then today, there's actually been latest news saying that SolarWinds was actually warned of these insecurities that caused the breach to happen in their network over 3 years ago. So Obviously this isn't good news. SolarWinds, I don't want to bash them too much. Obviously, there were a lot of moving mechanisms that had to happen in order for this to just keep on getting ignored. So I can't blame them completely, obviously, in this case, but there are news reports saying that they were aware of their insecurities. And then I would say more the interesting news these days is the fact that, well, what's the next thing that's going to happen because of this? And as Michael had pointed out and touched on, really the golden goose is being able to attack the authentication mechanisms. And there's a few articles on there talking about how the attackers are actually going after cloud assets now, because as you know, a lot of companies out there are using Microsoft 365 and their MFA. And the reality is, if you can somehow compromise some of that, you can actually create what's known as tokens. So we use tokens to actually authenticate across multiple, what we call federated systems, but interconnected systems. Essentially, if you can forge a token, you can log into anything with any credential you want, with not really much difficulty. So they're saying that that's actually one of the highest targets, highest sought after targets that they expect these attackers to go after. So I think that kind of completes the timeline in a nutshell. Michael, is there anything else you'd like to add?
Oh, so much, Moro. So much. I think this is more or less accurate. There's a few things in this timeline that I was aware of before the dates that are on the timeline, but yeah, it's all pretty much as is. Derek had just asked a question in the chat saying, how do they know that they were breached between March and June? And there's actually some really good information for that. The first and foremost piece of evidence is that the Trojanized DLL was digitally signed using SolarWinds' own digital code signing certificate, and the dates of those Trojanized ones were in a certain date. They also know that there were tampered, untrojanized versions in this same time frame. They also have correlated with data from people who were breached about when the Trojanized malwares entered. And of course, they have checksums for all of these things. I'll just give you an example. If you've got a really good tool in your environment that, Carbon Black, CrowdStrike, something like that, Microsoft Defender ATP, and you run it over time, you end up with a large pool of telemetry about where every file that was ever written in your environment, and even if you don't have the original data, you have what's called an indicator graph that can tell you when each file first appeared in your environment. And many of the people that are breached had that data and were able to say, aha, even though we didn't know we were had this in March, we now know through retrospective data that that was the first date that that hash was ever seen, and we know its file name and which server and how it got there and so forth. So this timeline is a really solid timeline.
Yeah, I was going to add to it. So there's even some indication saying that they can kind of pinpoint that at what time this threat actor was actually planning this. And they're actually saying that it was probably sometime in October 2019, so almost a year ago. So you have to understand that they took a lot of they took a lot of patience building this and planning it and executing it. So it's something to keep in mind that this wasn't just something that happened overnight. Like most attacks or any breach really of any nature, they happen long before, like all the planning, all the recon to get into your network. And once they're in your network, they're going to work very hard not to get detected. So,
Adnan asks, do they know who's behind it? And I'm actually not going to answer that because, and I'm going to talk later about why it's not a relevant question. Right now, if you look on Twitter, you'll see many people in cybersecurity speculating about who it is. I know many professionals who have said we need to attribute this right away so we know how to defend ourselves. We do not need attribution. What we do need is a very good intelligence-led incident response process to allow us to come to a confident conclusion, but whether our own organizations are breached or not, to whatever extent we can be confident or not, and then come up with a plan of action to the extent that we can, given the high degree of uncertainty. It literally doesn't matter who it is. And you will see lots of reports talking about that there's more than one threat actor. Those are also solid too. There's lots of good intelligence dating back before this date showing that SolarWinds was breached by multiple parties, and that they had multiple vulnerabilities over the years, and that many of their customers have been breached through vulnerabilities in their product in the last year. These are all separate issues with separate consequences and require separate actions and analysis. And so I'm just going to say, do we know who's behind it? Doesn't matter. Not to you and I. That's a question for the spies. And they have a whole different set of decisions to make than we do. Okay. Where do you want to go next, Moro?
I think that first slide that kind of shows the workflow, I guess, of how this attack unfolded. So, Michael, I don't know if you would like to tackle this or if you would like me to kind of go down the.
I'd like to explain this one.
Okay. Okay.
Because I've been knee deep in this for 2 weeks, so
absolutely,
I can explain this whole thing and more in my sleep.
Perfect.
So this attack is really quite interesting. It doesn't matter if you're into threat intelligence or incident response, whether you're just an IT guy, whether you're a malware reverser, there's something for everyone in this attack. So here's what happened. Think back to the timeline that Moro just showed. Sometime around March or prior to March, the adversary is called UNC 2452. I'm just going to call him 2452. So 2452 gets access to the SolarWinds infrastructure, specifically the infrastructure used to distribute patches. So what they do is they also got access to the infrastructure for digitally signing SolarWinds code. They took a DLL that is a legitimate part of SolarWinds Orion. This DLL here, SolarWinds Orion Core business layer.dll, and they put a very, very tiny trojan in it. And then they digitally signed it and they put it on SolarWinds patch distribution system. And so if sometime after March you installed SolarWinds Orion, very specific versions, or if you patched, you would end up with a perfectly working, perfectly functional version of SolarWinds Orion, but with this trojanized DLL. Now, what this trojanized DLL did, and this is, let me explain what's in Microsoft's diagram here, is this DLL is actually loaded by a program called SolarWinds Business Layer.exe. And that little thing is responsible for conducting inventory in SolarWinds Orion. So SolarWinds Orion monitors all your assets, and you have to be able to inventory those assets. And so whenever the inventory process triggers, it would load this DLL, and then the backdoor would activate. Now, this is, the terminology is really hard because activate could mean a bunch of things, but what in this case it means is that this little tiny piece of Trojan code would run. And the first thing it would do is it would inspect the environment it's running on. So first of all, this DLL gets loaded by a lot of stuff, but it would not do anything unless it was loaded by this exe. So if you're trying to do forensics on this, you'd see nothing. If you were suspicious of it, you'd see nothing. It's only when it's running and only when the inventory component runs, the backdoor starts. The backdoor says, hey, let's take a look at the current host. And there is a whole bunch of kill switches built into this DLL, all designed to avoid being observed. Why would they do that? because our threat actor is very likely spies. Their goal is espionage. Their goal is not ransomware. Their goal is not stealing random Joe's data. They want to compromise their targets and then not get caught for a very long time. And this is unusual. Think about ransomware. It doesn't care if it gets caught. If it gets caught on 100 servers, as long as it gets one, that's all they care about. These guys are very different. So it inspects it, and the first thing it does is it does a DNS lookup for its command and control server, which was done over DNS, and we're going to talk about that in a second. But if the response of that DNS, when it does that lookup, came back to be certain IP addresses that are unexpected, like private IPs, not the actual ones of the C2 servers, or Microsoft IPs, then it would go, holy crap, maybe we're in a sandbox. Maybe someone's doing forensics on us. That's not what we expected. Shut down, never activate again. It would also look to see if the server it was running on had any kind of forensic tools or security tools. And this is one of the things that boggles people's mind, is it would shut down at the first sight of seeing Carbon Black, Tanium, CrowdStrike. It would shut down if it saw Wireshark or the Microsoft sysinternals. And it did that so it would never, ever execute or go to the later stages if it was being observed, because they did not want anyone to suspect what was going on unless they could succeed. So the whole idea was 100% success or nothing. And it really worked, because from March until December, they went unobserved and successful in so many organizations. Now, once it did look up that C2, if it didn't find any reason to shut down, it would then start looking for commands and direct to a secondary command and control server. Now, this was also clever because these ones were all fixed. If you knew what to look for, you could find it. But these would change per customer, and they actually would host the secondary command and control on a separate infrastructure for every victim. And they would try to put them in the same country so that if you were observing your traffic carefully, you would notice nothing out of the ordinary, or at the very least, be completely uncertain as to whether what you were seeing was malicious or not. And that's going to be a recurring theme. At every phase, if you did get suspicious, you were very likely to be uncertain of what you were looking at, and therefore you wouldn't take action or you'd ignore it. Now, finally, once they got to the secondary C2, they could run some basic commands against the back door, but really what they were trying to do at this point was get a second piece of malware, a stage 2 called Teardrop. Teardrop, a little bit bigger footprint. And then from there, they would install something else, often Cobalt Strike. Cobalt Strike, if you don't know, it is a, quote, legitimate penetration testing tool that is mostly used for criminals. The amount of damage Cobalt Strike does to us through criminal action is immense. It's hard to detect. It's very powerful. It's stealthy. It's configurable. It was used extensively here, but not exclusively. And then finally, they would move on to a third phase, which was a complete compromise of the authentication systems of the victims. And in not every case, in many, many of the cases, there was a pattern that was the same, though the technology was different. So the pattern would be that they would attack the underlying trust mechanisms or the cryptographic keys used to establish authentication rather than stealing actual passwords. And then they would do the normal stuff you expect in every attack, compromise the domain controllers, start stealing emails, putting in backdoors all over the place, pivoting, exfiltrating data, and who knows what else, different for every victim. So that is the attack in a nutshell. And we could probably do an episode on every stage of that.
I was gonna say, yeah, it's a good recap, but the reality is, and time will tell. We'll probably get even more information as everyone else investigates and shares that data, right? So, I don't know, Michael. Did you want to talk about some of the beaconing and the DNS?
I'm going to talk about this. I'm going to talk about this briefly.
You did a pretty good job.
Because I want to talk later about attribution, and I think all of us want to talk a little bit about the nature of the victims that are being revealed, etc. And it all comes down to this. When we do our Technical Tuesday next week, I will go into more detail. This has been a bit of a hobby of mine for a week. So very early on, it was revealed that the stage 1 command and control for this threat always included a subdomain of this. So this avsvmcloud.com, that's the main command and control. And it was always one of 4 subdomains: EU West, US West, US East. It kind of starts, again, they're trying to make it look like it could be a legitimate content distribution network for patching. And you see that they add an extra name, appsync.api. Again, if you were observing this, you'd be completely uncertain as to whether this was legitimate. It doesn't look fraudulent. And the only thing that would get your attention is this random string at the front. And a lot of our legitimate communication these days uses a random identifier within it. But so does a lot of illegitimate activity. There was speculation at first, was this DNS exfiltration? Was this DNS-based command and control? It turns out FireEye and others did some really good work in realizing that this string at the very front that looks random is an encoded string. And it contains 2 things. It contains a unique identifier assigned to every victim. So when that stage 1 malware runs, it creates a unique ID based on the MAC address of the host it's on. And it also contains a second part that can be decoded that contains more information about the victim, including their domain name, their internal Active Directory domain name or host name. So when this was discovered, some people started, I think Reddrip published a decoder for it. So if you saw these beacons in a log, you could decode them. Without going into a huge amount of detail, you will see lists floating around right now that have thousands of these beacons. Where do they get those beacons, you might ask? Well, there are companies that passively collect DNS lookups. They buy them from other companies. They collect them themselves. So for instance, Cisco Umbrella has huge logs of every DNS lookup because they're a DNS security company. And you can buy these records from companies. Well, these lists are aggregations of these. So for instance, there's a couple really popular ones floating around, and that's where you'll see most of this attribution. I was able to collect an additional 700 over what I saw that weren't covered in the other public leaks. And you can decode all of these. And the really challenging part is quite often you'll see multiple beacons that is one piece of information. So these strings on the left or on the right are incomplete. They might be the first part of a string, the middle part of a string, or the last part of a string. And so when you see something here like AMR corp.intel, you don't know if there's something before the AMR or something after the intel. Or maybe it's complete. So like arioncorp.com or bmrrn.com could be the complete thing. But here you see centralpima.g. Well, there was probably something after that G. And you see itsisstate.ed. That's probably .edu, probably. And there's a lot of organizations right now combing through this and trying to attribute these to actual organizations so that they can inform them or determine whether maybe this is one of your vendors and you need to contact them for a response so that you can determine whether there's an elevated level of risk because you do business with them. And the big concern is we see a number of very large companies like Cisco, Checkpoint, NVIDIA, there's ISPs, there's banks, you name it, because Orion is used in some of the biggest companies as well as mid-sized companies. Concern being that if Cisco's in here, what if they were breached? Could the threat actor then use Cisco to do the same attack again? What if they compromised Cisco and then Cisco customers got a Trojan? That's why this is the gift that we'll keep on giving this Christmas. Now, I want to say we cannot overstate these. We cannot assume these companies were breached because this is stage one. And if I go back to our original diagram, all this means is that it got to this part. So we know if we saw a beacon, the backdoor activated, it inspected the environment, it did not find any reason to deactivate, which is sad because it means they didn't have one of 50 or so security tools on those servers. Do you feel the shame? Like, come on. If you had if you had TCP dump, it didn't run. It shut down. If you had Carbon Black, it shut down. Anyways, enough of the shame. All it means is it got to the stage where it did C2. Now, here's the thing: is that the reason why it was shutting down if it was being observed is because as soon as it got to stage 2, there was a greater chance it would be caught. So, in all these environments where they're on this list, they might have caught it at stage 2. Now, stage 3 is a really big deal because at stage 3, if it gets that far, they can go very stealthy. They can do a lot of things to cover their tracks. And at that point, it's a really, really, really difficult incident response. It's difficult to establish the scope of what happened. But stage 2, a lot of these companies had capability of blocking it there. But again, the whole idea of this was uncertainty. Even if you blocked it, and even if you looked at the data, you wouldn't know what you were looking at. And it's very likely you would conclude your investigation and move on. And I suspect that many of the companies on this list may have blocked it, may have responded, but just moved on until now. So when you see these lists and you see journalists making it sound like earlier last week, people said Microsoft is on this list and said, oh my God, Microsoft's been compromised. Come on. And Microsoft was very good at very rapidly coming out with a response and explaining transparently what they had done and what that meant. It is to be expected that these organizations had this software. It is to be expected that many of them would be on this list. And I will go into more detail later about what you should do if you're on the list or not on the list. That's really what I want to talk about. But now I'm going to shut up because I like to let other people have a turn talking.
Well, I'm going to say one thing. So in regards to everything that Michael went down and explained, I will say this. I'm going to give props out to Microsoft. Normally, I badmouth Microsoft, even though I'm an MCSE. But I will say in this case, you know what? They did a bang-up job. They helped try and stop this in its tracks once it was discovered anyways. So I got to give them props. So, you know, and props out to FireEye because honestly, and it's unfortunate that, you know, it took a breach for them to identify it. Obviously, you know, as Michael explained, this thing was just really crazy stealthy. But yeah, I mean, but it was out. You know, it was after they got breached. All the effort and the work they put in. Got to give them props for that. So just
The
wanted
level of coordination between
yes.
entities that I don't think can coordinate that easily was amazing. For Microsoft, earlier you had mentioned Microsoft took over that command and control domain that we showed. For them to coordinate with the necessary bodies, of course, they had federal government assistance.
Yeah,
helps a lot.
But someone got to do it, right? And they did it. So it's like, dang. Right?
They put in a kill switch, much like has happened in many malware attacks in the past, and made sure that if this malware is active today, that initial C2 is dead. That's stage 1. All right, Jared, give us a response to what I've just rambled on about. Is there anything you want to add or another topic you want to put in there?
Not another topic. I think the key thing right now is so first of all, thank you, because that's probably one of the that's an amazing summary and overview as to like what has actually happened here through the entire process. I think the thing that I would sort of tack on here is that you used a really important word up front, which was patience. Because we've seen like the malware attacks, the ransomware attacks have scaled over the last 2 to 3 years. This isn't the first tool of this kind to get breached or get used to actually facilitate an attack. And this is where the patience comes in, because usually, like you pointed out, you get to stage 1, they would blast it out there and away it would go. And this time around, they've had 2 to 3 years worth of watching these attacks by either other groups or subgroups or whomever, just sort of learn from what worked, what didn't work, and then really put a plan together and actually come together and act it out. The coordination has been is ridiculously good, just based on that. And really, this has taken it to another level at that point. So I think that that just being patient and watching, the fact that you can stay inside the environment for so long was a massive piece here. And having 3 stages of an attack is really that core thing, because if anybody previously over the last 2 to 3 years had done the first 2 stages effectively, we would be having a completely different conversation right now. As far as like who had been breached and who hadn't been breached and which tools have been used. So anyway, I think that's kind of where I'm at with some of that. It's just that it's also separating out the legitimate information from the information that's still in process. And I think that's a key part here too, is what do we know for sure, and then what can we sort of what's circumspect that's going to come after this.
I couldn't agree more. In fact, everything I find interesting about this incident. Okay, so people who know me, I'm very technical, I'm very geeky. I could go on and on about, there's a million technical details we're not even going to mention that all make it hard to detect. And if you saw it, you'd go, oh, that's just a JSON transaction. It looks normal. But what really gets me is that this tells us a lot about how to improve our own incident response and our own analysis when we're looking at something and we're saying, is this evil? How would I know? And what should I do? And what decision should I make? And how do I make that decision? How do I know when to call that decision? And I'd look back into my own career of the incidents I've dealt with, and it wasn't until this one I started reflecting, going, yeah, the hard part is the decision making. Finding the indicators of compromise is a challenge. It's a technical challenge. We have to take on that technical challenge with our skills. But there's another part. Not every incident has a clear indicator. Now we look back at this and we're like, yeah, we could just find this domain. Well, you know what? In March, no one knew that was evil. So, and there's lots and lots of other domains that are used in this. So how do you deal with that uncertainty? I'll add one more thing to react to what you just said, Jared, is, the patience is a big key thing. And we expect that from an espionage actor. This isn't the earliest. If you work in industrial control systems, you're familiar with Fancy Bear. If you think back into the earlier part of this decade, Havoc's, Lights Out, things like that, they were doing very stealthy techniques as well, many of which look a lot like these techniques. And those actors had huge amounts of patience because it was espionage. But we've begun to see criminal actors get patient, most recently with the aggressive extortionists, the ransomware gangs. They used to just distribute a piece of malware, and if it worked, it worked. If it didn't, it didn't. And it would immediately infect all your computers like a worm. 2-3 years ago, that's what you'd see. Well, what we see today is they will get you in a 3-stage attack, just like this one. They will get you with a very light first stage, Emitet, Dridex. Then they'll get you with a second stage. It's a little bit bigger, TrickBot. Gives them better command and control. Then they'll spend 3 days, 2 weeks, maybe a month.
Yeah.
Looking through your environment, being really stealthy, living off the land, not installing more malware, trying not to drop files until they can steal some passwords, get domain admin, explore your environment, and then when they're ready, and only when they're ready, boom, they'll steal your data, trash all your systems, and encrypt your stuff and ransomware you. And that's what we see today. So there is a growing level of patience amongst the aggressive criminal actors as well. And this is bad news for us when they start adopting what we used to think were exclusively the advanced persistent techniques from espionage actors are now being picked up by aggressive extortionists. We really do need to improve our decision-making skills and our analysis skills, because that's how you beat a patient actor.
And then just to sort of tack on there about even when we're talking about the DNS aspect of this, I mean, you had to have, if you wanted to have things in the, global, internet in general, anybody at this level that might already be blocking newly observed domains and newly, created domains anyway, as just a general rule from pick your vendor's security profile. So there's a time to live that has to happen, and a number of cycles that have to happen anyway before you can even, start moving on to the next stage.
Yeah, that's a really, really good point, is that a lot of this infrastructure was stood up with patience and advanced planning as well. Fortunately, we see a lot of our criminal threat actors tend to rush and play fast, but they may begin to plan well ahead as like this one as well.
Well, if you're not hurting for money, you can be patient. And I think, that's sort of the other point with this, is that a lot of your ransomware gangs and those types of scenarios are get in, get the buck, and then get out, go dormant, and then come back later with a different plan. When the money runs out. Or you need to fund something else, right? This is why this looks more well funded, because if you're paying me, I'll sit here and watch for it all day long, right? But if you're not paying me, well, I better go do something to make some money so I can eat, right?
So maybe I wouldn't mind backing up a little bit and just talk about the general nature and history of supply chain attacks, because there's a couple aspects, and I really want to dive into the decision-making skills and intelligence-led incident response. Before we do that, we really should talk about the history of supply chain, and that this isn't new. And Moro, Jared, do either one of you want to start?
I mean, I guess I can kind of start. I mean, I don't know if I could pinpoint to when this concept of supply chain really came into existence in terms of using it as a threat vector. I can tell you stories of various things that I've encountered over the years, even before I kind of delved into security. I can at least tell you about one incident think it was Symantec that wrote a paper on it. I want to say circa 2013, maybe even earlier than that, where they were identifying an Asian threat actor. I want to say Chinese, but I'm not going to say, you know, for certain. How they were talking about how they breached, I believe it was either NASA or DoD at the time. And essentially the way the actor got into the network was they were able to modify either a driver so that the network card would actually start capturing packets on the network, and then they would steal data. And the way they actually got in was they were able to do something similar like a supply chain attack, in the sense that the government agency at the time was using a AV solution, or an endpoint protection solution, that was heavily reliant on whitelists and blacklists. And essentially any file that didn't have a signature and was not on the whitelist, good luck trying to install it. And I tell you, based on the analysis Symantec did, it took the threat actor almost 2 years before they were able to actually get that driver going. And the way they did it was essentially, yeah, they decided, well, we can't get into the systems, it's too locked down. What's the next best thing? We'll attack the provider. So they attacked the endpoint protection provider, basically breached their network, took a file, used their own encryption and not encryption, sorry, cryptographic signature, signed the file, and that's how they got in. So, I mean, like I said, this threat vector has existed for a while now. We're only seeing how vast it could be in terms of damaging. What I'm talking about only happened to one U.S. agency. This attack today, or this last few weeks, or this year, it's affected, you know, thousands, hundreds of thousands of companies now. So
the NotPetya WannaCry incidents from a few years ago, which was at the time thought to be the most devastating cyber attack globally, just for its financial costs. That was a supply chain attack as well, targeting Ukrainian companies. So they Trojanized a particular program that's very popular. I think it was in manufacturing in Ukraine, and had, you know, it was thought that the threat actors had been reckless in arrogantly assuming that it wouldn't spread beyond their targets. In many cases, that pattern is repeated here, that the threat actor has been reckless in that they probably had specific victims in mind, but compromised the supply chain to get to them, and then ended up causing the whole world concern. Also think of CC Cleaner. Compromised. For those who don't know, CC Cleaner, a piece of free software that can be used to clean up your registry, wipe evidence of all your naughty misdeeds on your computer, uninstall broken programs. It's a really great fix-it program for your computer, well trusted. And a few years back, someone broke into their update servers, Trojanized it, and caused havoc. And a really common thing today, more common than most people will admit, is developers are being compromised every day through typo squatting on mirrors of their library package systems for the programming languages. So you're programming in Python, in R, in whatever. All of these languages have their own little package installers, and they have their own distribution servers. And there are people that are uploading programs that are mistyping one letter of a package name. And so you go to type in pip install my favorite library, and you miss the Y. You don't know it, but you have a Trojanized library. Then you go build your software, and you've distributed that Trojanized version. And that is happening way more than people realize. If you're a dev, I do not know what advice to give you, except double check and do not type, like, copy paste. DevOps is your friend.
Oh yeah. Actually, so more to the point, I guess, you know, as an example of how easy it is to inject, you know, malicious code into existing applications or code. I know Michael and I, we did a live stream in October I think it was for Halloween. It was the monster book, and Michael demonstrated, theoretically, and again, we're positing in a theory, if you could break into someone that essentially provides software or hardware or updates or any kind of service to any, thousands of customers, all you need to do is attack them, compromise one thing, and now you've got a whole entire distribution network right at your,
Oh, it wasn't theoretical. I was reproducing the events of the early 2010s
That's
that Fancy Bear did, where they would go after makers of it specialized industrial software,
mhm,
compromise them, and then the installers
mhm,
for that ICS software, that SCADA software,
mhm.
they would just put that on the websites of these vendors, and then everyone who used those industrial control systems would gladly run with sysadmin rights, install this program, and the program would work, but it would also get a backdoor. That was really common. I think, Jared, you wanted to talk about RMM and the supply chain attacks that have occurred in recent history.
Yeah, I mean, this is where things get interesting, or more interesting. I guess they're already pretty interesting, because it really comes down to your choose your own adventure at this point. For the attacker. I mean, supply chain. It's interesting. We're talking about a purely digital aspect right now. But even in September, I think it was September when we had the hospitals or the medical side being attacked, and we ended up with people, I think in Germany and then also in the U.S. actually, being redirected to other hospitals and passing away. I mean, that's a very specific, true to life type of supply chain attack at that point. And these things can take on different, characteristics. So knowing how far we've come in such a short amount of time in how it can be distributed really kind of dials us back as to now from a general system perspective, how do we properly manage our clients within the organization. How do we easily manage without having a one-to-one type of situation with a tech to the employee, being able to now walk up to that person 100% of the time, every time, and be able to have other things in place. How do we manage the environment effectively, securely, with a level of confidence? And I think, Michael, you're going to be talking about some of that, because that's where the conversations happen, upstream, as to like, how can you put things into production, and then be able to report and be confident that you're still at the same state as to what you're expecting that state to be at. And I think that's maybe part of our problem right now is we've had the ransomware and different malware type of attacks that have happened, and we've keep adjusting. We've seen the RMM providers in general. There's now different alliances that have come together, even though they're competitors, actually trying to work together to try to improve their cybersecurity presence as far as like how their products are coming to market. um and some of this has also been mechanics shop at times, where a provider has put out a solution with strong warning, saying if you're going to take on the responsibility of running this tool set yourself and managing it in-house, you need to stay on top of patching, you need to do all these things, because we're putting all the dev work in and to give you this. Or you can go to our cloud solution, where we're just automatically ramming through all the patching, and whether or not that breaks something in your environment or not, we don't care, but we know that you're going to always be at whatever our level of compliance is for our product. And so that's been part of the conversation here as well. And so as a positive thing that we've seen, or I've seen, has been more communication over the last 3 years coming from those vendors, when they have been discovering things. SolarWinds being the unfortunate party, based on the scale and how this is being done. But there are 3 or 4 other ones that have had like large scale breaches and attacks that have been there. They've been leveraged to for attacks that have also touched municipal government and organizations scaling to the thousands of endpoints. I just think that now we're talking about something that's not as easy as saying, hey, we're just going to roll a patch out. It's not just a matter of just patching, patch everything on the network and patch, the RMM solution and hey, we're good guys, like we'll move on and wait for the next one. I think we're at a point now where there's needs to be more due diligence from all parties. There's the upstream, coming from the vendor saying, here's where we're at. And then I think it's also the conversation going back to the vendors saying, from the client perspective, or the group that's managing, for a list of, thousands of endpoints, saying, here's what we're seeing. We need, here are our requirements to be able to go back and be able to be confident in your product. And Michael, you've heard me say this. I mean, cybersecurity is a team event. I mean, it's a team sport. I mean, and I think that works both internally as well as externally. That's how I approach a lot of my vendor relations with vendors. If a vendor is not willing to be a two-way partner with me, give me what I need and then allow me to give you feedback, then maybe you're not the best partner for me, because I need to be able to give you, and I'm not perfect. I know you're not going to be perfect. So we need to have that general discussion point, especially when we're spending, name your dollar amount on different solutions. And I don't think that the right solution, like all the time, is to, that provider had a problem and just knee jerk out, 5,000 endpoints or 20,000 endpoints and jump over to provider B, because, well, what's going to happen when provider B has a problem? I mean, I'm not saying that's not a valid conversation to have, but this is where I think some of these discussions now, especially with this situation, need to go.
Early in this this incident with SolarWinds, I'm going to be really critical. There's a lot of people that claim to work in security on Twitter who aren't presenting themselves as security professionals, and there's rampant speculation. There's harsh conclusions. There's things that are clearly making bold statements and opinions without performing an analysis. And one of those was so many people, sysadmins and security people, saying, hey, who else is going to dump SolarWinds? Wow, SolarWinds is crap. And you know what? You could criticize SolarWinds as a product, and your choice to renew it or not to renew it isn't about this breach. It's about, because you could go pick another product, and that product is equally likely, or maybe not, but there is a non-zero chance that that product could be used in a supply chain attack. That product, just because they haven't been breached, is not necessarily immune to this. And our challenge is actually, how do we deal with the risk associated with supply chain attacks? How do we advise our leaders on how to make good choices in this regard? And how do we, as IT people, come up with something that allows us to monitor that, to put controls in place, and to have some confidence that the trust we place in these tools isn't misplaced? So I'll give you an example. Company I worked for a long time ago had a really, I think it was SAP or something, really big system that was critical, had all the confidential data in it, and we had a third party who maintained it. We didn't have in-house expertise on that, and they had to come in and service it periodically, and also had to audit it to validate, like SOX validation, that it was worthy of holding our financial records, and attest to that. And we would have to let them in remotely because the people doing that weren't local. So we had a special router for that inside our network, directly attached. And we didn't have a lot of segmentation, but we didn't trust it. It had ultimate privilege over our most confidential data. So literally this little box was unplugged, except when the change periods would come where they were allowed in. And so we would confirm 24 hours in advance that they were ready to do their work. Then before, someone's job was, before you went home, you'd go and plug it in, and then they would do their work, and the next day we'd unplug it again. And things have gotten so complicated that if I were to tell, like Jared, if I were to tell you, hey, that's how all of your clients should treat you, you'd be like, I can't get my work done.
Yeah, or the SLAs just go way, way up, and
yeah, the costs.
Yep.
Your costs go up, their costs go up.
That's right.
But it's undeniable. So we've been talking about RMM. So for those who don't know, we're talking about the remote management systems that managed service providers use. So you think LogMeIn, TeamViewer. Trying to think of the one I used at my last employer. We didn't actually use the RMM, but we used the giant platform, and tons of the world's largest managed service providers use this thing. And a bunch of those managed service providers were breached a year or two ago. Some of the largest ones in the world, and they were used to breach those companies. And this is the funny thing is when it comes to RMM, and there are tons of them out there, every managed service provider uses them. And then we put those things on everyone's desktop and on servers. And what we don't realize is that in many of those managed service providers, the providers very different practices. And in many of the largest ones, everybody has access to everything. There isn't differential levels. It's not universally true. But then the question is, so do we know? Have we asked? Can we verify that? Have we verified it? So does a tier one tech at your global giant managed service provider have access to all your servers? And if his account is compromised, does the criminal now have access to all of their customers, including yours? And sometimes they don't, it's not just remote access, it's remote management. They'll install software. And the problem is that this has been used in the past to install backdoors. I'm going to make a prediction. I know it's not New Year's yet. It's our Christmas Eve episode, but 2021 is going to be the year that the ransomware actors start to leverage supply chain because it's easy and it's effective. And right now they're leveraging email compromises, tricking you into running documents with macros because it works. And they've started in this last year to leverage extensively brute forcing of RDP and Citrix and things like that, or exploiting vulnerabilities in them because it's easy and they can delegate it to other criminals to get the initial compromise. Well, next year, they're going to delegate it to people who specialize in supply chain attacks, not on this grand scale, not as stealthy, but they won't care. Because when they get one, it means they get a ton of victims. And we have to start dealing with that. Do either of you have any ideas of what we can do? I have a whole bunch of theoretical ones. I can put on my architect hat and be all highfalutin and go zero trust, segmentation, internal monitoring, application control. But they're all right, but they're also easier said than done.
Yeah, exactly. Right. I mean, there's a lot of great technology out there. Doesn't mean that everyone's going to use it. And obviously not everyone understands their network enough that they could say, let's use IPS. It's like, well, maybe you don't need IPS. Maybe you need a secure email gateway because that's how most of the attacks are happening, right? So I think, a lot of people are going to have to either A, step back, or B, bring someone in that can give an objective viewpoint so that, it's like, this is your number one attack vector that, people are getting into your network with, right? So as far as I'm concerned, I'm going to have to say in those kinds of cases, if it were up to me, I'd probably start looking at UEBA. I mean, amongst the other things, I think UEBA is probably the strategy I would gravitate towards so that, I would understand what normalized behavior is on my network. And then once a device or an entity goes outside of those bounds, then I could decide what I want to do with it, right? Or at least, further the investigation, so to speak. So it's not a silver bullet. There just isn't. But if I want to, I guess, get a handle on what's normal versus what's outside normal, and then, start to make my decisions around that and plan around that, I would say UEBA or some sort of UEBA technology.
Kyle Hausen in the chat has just said EDR, and
Oh,
in a lot of the people that easily dealt with this, EDR was critical. I'll explain a little bit more why that is, but these advanced endpoint detection and response tools really help you to determine behaviors, as you're saying, but also to expedite your response capability.
mm-hmm.
Any thoughts, Jared, on what we do to deal with RMM and supply chain?
Oh, yeah, and this is the thing is I think we're at a point now where we're behind where those actors have been for, let's say, the last year or two. Like they have had such a big head start on even getting this into production right now. I guess then the first question is to ask is, okay, great, SolarWinds in particular, we've seen this with them. Here's the next, the top 5. Here's the next 4 providers. How can we be confident that we're not, that they're not already breached? So that's maybe the first question, is to what things that we can actually start putting back in, and which I think is part of the conversation piece. Just to start with, so from a development perspective is, what things can we actually learn from where we're at right now, and how can we ramp up? So I think one of the things that we do have going for us as a general community has been and you alluded to this earlier, is the amount of very fast response and solid information sharing, I think, has been the thing that to really kickstart things. And I think the momentum of that can't be lost. I think that if we lose the momentum on that right now, I think that's where we're going to get ourselves back into trouble again, just globally, with the tool sets, because we can't give a better synopsis to make even the recommendations back to the vendor, because they might not have seen something that we've seen in the environment as well. So I think that's part of it. And Kyle actually brings up a really good point about EDR. And so in my case, not a SolarWinds customer, but there are different SolarWinds tools that we found, or some of the IOCs within clients, at different times, not active, but when we started to run through the procedure, and what it turned out to be was I was 30 minutes ahead of one of my vendors by being able to put something in place, and I was about an hour behind the other vendor. And which means that so what that tells me is that people were talking and working together in such a consolidated fashion that we were all moving in the right direction at the same time. And that gives me, brings my optimist side back a little bit for this. But I think that's kind of the piece where we need to go is really, do a really good analysis on where we're at, and then some, maybe some better planning about where we can go here in 2021.
Yeah, that's a good point. Actually, you know what would be really nice is almost like an whether it's a nonprofit or I guess arm's length government entity, but someone, some organization that could collectively help, almost like triage, right? Almost like the WHO. I don't want to say the WHO because they kind of suck right now, but something like that, right? Where it's like, if you're breached, you can go to this, whatever non affiliated entity or organization, and they can help you through trying to remediate and or investigate a breach when it occurs. At least in that way, you have a central place that you can communicate with, and hopefully that central entity would be able to not just disseminate the info, but also collect it from other victims.
So that does happen in ISACs to varying degrees.
Yes, I guess.
I have a seat on FSISAC, and I think that they've done a pretty darn good job. Not as fast as me, but They were, when their advice came out, I said, damn,
Yeah. Yeah.
that's pretty good. In the States, CISA's done it, and I've heard some commentary that that's not really their role, but they did it, and no one else filling the void. And the first thing you said is, isn't there someone we could turn to? And I wanted to cough and go, Microsoft, because while FireEye led the very rapid technical analysis because they were affected and they found this first, Microsoft did a heck of a lot to coordinate people and take a decisive action that materially reduced the risk of this threat to everyone. But we can't depend upon Microsoft to be the world's police force. And honestly, if you think about what they did with TrickBot a few months ago and this, I think they sort of are the world's cyber police force.
You know what? I hate to agree with you, but I do agree with you on this one topic. But I also feel like, yes, there are certainly organizations that definitely take on that task, but I feel like, that's not their official capacity. And it could be better organized worldwide, not just by, for the most part, American companies, right? And nothing against Americans or American companies. I'm just saying it'd be nice to have something that was more global with everyone's input into it.
Right? And Jared, I think you can relate to this. Okay, so the large and medium-sized companies, they can go to ISACs and they can literally leverage, say the government agencies will pay attention because maybe they're critical. But we have all these little companies that depend on MSPs, and they have some risk due to MSP, but they also have the benefit of the MSP. But the problem is when these critical things happen, you can't go to them and say, well, we can start working on it, but I can't give you an estimate of what it's going to cost. And then they're like, no, sorry, who do we turn to? So Moro, you're kind of right that there's a gap.
That's why I was kind of hinting at that, right? Like the idea that, it should be an entity that anyone could go to, right? Regardless of, where your financial status is. Because again, you're right. Like, you can't always depend on an MSP in that regard. But hey, things might change. Who knows? 2021 is a new year, and maybe the COVID virus will mutate itself out of existence. I can only.
Well, Moro, you're not wrong. I mean, I'm right there with you actually, both on the Microsoft side as being a leader. I don't think so, and I think the reason why they can be a leader. Oops, sorry guys, new cat problems.
I like cats.
But one of the reasons why Microsoft can be a real leader in this is if you look at their reach. They have whatever it is, how many billions of endpoints collecting telemetry. Okay. So that's why you can be a leader is that you have anonymous analytics coming in and you can actually help with the overall, provide information back into a community as well. So that's part of it. And then you also have, if you even just at a large scale, this is before we ever talk about, government organizations, even just from the general vendor scale at that point, you have other vendors that also now compete in the same space, and it's about what agreed upon information would we globally want to have out there that's truly anonymous, but could provide benefit for indicators and to be able to actually lead. Now, I also agree that we do need a place to be able to, report without shame. I think that's part of this as well, is because just because you are breached doesn't mean that you need to be, how many businesses have we seen lost, have either had to restructure, based on, reputation. And that's a really big problem out there as well. But how do you also then have the same businesses not wanting to report, and we have that problem, where, if you're a financial services, company, okay, who are the top 3, organizations that you actually need to report to? You have staff that are accredited. Do they have to report? And what is the easiest way from an incident response perspective to actually handle all that data collection and and get it done so that's not sitting there 6 months, a year, 2 years down the road, and things are still being audited from the original breach, and you might have already had 2 more breaches since then, but you're not even done your data collection at this point. So streamlining a lot of this, I think, is going to be the key to our success. But yeah, it starts with being able to even just report properly, I think. you know.
I want to move on to the topic I'm really passionate about, and it's going to take me about 15 minutes.
Okay.
But before that, I think I'm going to try to summarize what everyone said here, and I'm going to add another thing. So, in dealing with the potential for a supply chain compromise through RMM or an MSP, I do have a distinct piece of advice. And as a former service provider, I actually built this into a service and got my customers to validate what I did. And so here's what I'd ask you to do. If you're using an MSP, or if you are an MSP, offer this. What you should do is have a conversation with your MSP about their remote access and how they use it, when they use it, and what the rules are around it. Look for some transparency. Now, they're going to make claims. It's all going to look rosy. You need a way to validate it. So what you want to ask for is a monthly report that includes a list of all of the remote access that occurred and which of their people did it with, and it, here's the thing, it doesn't have to be a perfect level of detail. Just something you can verify and look for. And you know what? You don't need to go over that list looking for anything in particular. All you need to do is look at it every month and compare it to last month and look for differences. I've done this successfully with my clients and basically said, look, I'm going to give you this report every month, and it's got all the changes we made and all the things we did, and then little tallies like, here's a list of the backups we did, here's a list of the changes we made, here's a list of all of the firewall changes, and you don't even have to understand what those mean. You just have to look at it and go, that stands out, and ask us about it. Ask your account manager. Because if you do get subjected to abuse, your MSP might not notice. They're very busy and they're trying to lower their costs to you. But you might notice if you have that auditable thing. And most importantly, if they're able to produce that record, it means if you do get breached, they probably have enough data to help you respond. If they can't produce that report, maybe you should invest a little bit more in your MSP because the race to the bottom doesn't work for the MSP and it doesn't work for you either. The second thing I want to summarize is advanced endpoint detection and response tools, EDR. Use them and put them on your servers too. I know too many environments where they put them on the desktop and then they say they don't put them on the server because they're afraid of breaking something. You should be afraid of things not breaking. You should be afraid of what the bad guys are doing to your servers while not breaking your servers. Whether it's ransomware, the ransomware guys, they do the same thing where they stealthily maintain access for a few months. And your EDR is either the way you're going to catch them or the source of telemetry and data that you need to respond quickly after the breach. And it's a way to contain it as well. And you can get those EDR services from MSPs too. You can have one MSP to make all your changes and you want transparency from them, and another MSP to detect and respond. That seems like a pretty good option to me. And as a leader, you don't have to be technical to say that's my strategy. Does that sound set? Am I wrong? And Jared, I know you represent an MSP. Am I being a hard ass here?
No, not at all, actually, because also as somebody who's, I would like to say lovingly critical of, within peer groups as well, also saying not perfect in this regard as well, but every MSP right now, or just consulting company in general, that has some sort of security practice, we all at different times are going to follow each other in some capacity in either a discovery or some sort of audit, or like something. And that's the thing is finding, even just a general baseline. Everybody kind of ranks things differently as well. There are some, ways to rank, or score different environments. But what you're saying there is absolutely 100% correct. The things that are my go-tos when I walk into an environment are what's turned on the edge and what's installed on the server. Let's just start there. And that's the first half an hour. And then that usually gives me a pretty good indication as to how the rest of my day is going to go. And then what that report's going to probably look like for the clients. Unfortunately, it becomes a little bit too rinse and repeat, because when we see the same thing where they've paid thousands for the tool set and haven't installed it 100% on, across the environment. I mean, and then when they do have a problem, then they're like, well, we paid thousands of dollars for this tool set, So, and it comes down to I guess I would say even just the basics of cyber hygiene at that point, 100%, what's your patching strategy? Where, like, who else are you coordinating with? Do you have a secondary, MSP or a different consulting company handling some of these things for you? Okay, well, what's the strategy behind how people respond? What is your incident response plan to this? Because those people are peers at that point. There shouldn't be, I'm not really worried if Moro, he said, hey, I'm going to be the consulting company at XYZ client. Perfect, Moro. I don't have to worry about this set of things. Okay, well, I'm worrying about this set of things. Let's have a monthly meeting and go over our results. This shouldn't be a hard conversation at this point. And I would just like to see better interaction between all players, right?
Agreed.
Okay. That being said, I'm going to talk about the thing that I came here for, very, very self-centeredly. I have something to share. And I realize this has gone really long. I'll probably have to split it up into 2 episodes when we publish this on YouTube and the podcast. There is a very effective strategy for dealing with these high uncertainty incidents. And it's very different than what many of us are used to doing in an incident response. Because what we're used to is we monitor our systems and we look for something. We depend very much on our technical tools to say, aha, I found something. And then we look at that alert, and we validate it, and we go, it's nothing, or it's something. And if it's something, we rapidly try to identify it, to contain it, and then to get back to normal. This is not that. And what I'm about to tell you, while I will say this is my own approach, it has been validated this week in the advice from multiple authoritative sources, including CISA, who basically said, here's what you should do to strategize over this. Lots of people will tell you how to respond. Oh, you got to change all your passwords. You've got to reimage your servers. You've got to isolate them and then investigate. There's something much more important you have to do first, and it will give your leaders confidence that you've dealt with it, and hopefully make sure your Christmas is not canceled. Okay, I'm going to share my screen here. There. So what you see here is the incident response lifecycle. This is taken from the standard NIST document on how to do incident response. If you're an IT professional who's new to incident response or you want some guidance, this is what everything in the world is more or less based on. I've taught many courses on this. Here's what you do in incident response. You spend a lot of time preparing, and then you monitor a lot of data. And when you detect something, you investigate it, you analyze it to determine whether it's actually an incident. And then you move as quickly as possible to contain that threat, to eradicate it completely, and then recover back to normal. Then, as post-incident activity, you learn your lessons, make your improvements, continue to prepare, and repeat. There's another way of looking at this. this is another very common model. And the idea here is you prepare, and then as you're monitoring, you go to a phase where you're trying to identify the threat. And then you rapidly move to containment, eradication, recovery. Now, the difference is that in a normal incident, say your antivirus says, I found some malware. You're going to do this identification phase very quickly. What you're going to do is try to identify that threat as quickly as you can so that you can move to contain it. And you're going to take some definitive action. You're going to pull the Ethernet off the server. You're going to click the quarantine button in your antivirus, taking that laptop mostly offline, but just giving you remote access, something like that. If it's ransomware, then maybe you start shutting things off so it won't spread. These things are incidents where we have a high degree of certainty. We are certain we've been compromised. We are certain we know the extent of the compromise, more or less. We might have some questions about it. We might have to verify it, but we are certain we can take action. Think about the stages of the incident we're talking about now, where in this model, at every single stage, the attacker is trying to build uncertainty into our decision-making process. So they compromise our supply chain so that it looks like we're downloading a legitimate component and we're unaware. Even if we were suspicious, even if SolarWinds was suspicious, they would look at it and go, well, it looks normal. They backdoor a normal DLL that's expected to run in an expected way. And they make the initial compromise really small. They make it so that its behavior with these C2 URLs looks like what we'd normally see. So if you got someone really astute looking at your network logs, even in detail, this would not look unusual compared to all the other traffic they see. In this attack, if you were to dissect the traffic, it even looked like the normal web service interactions and the normal JSON data that your legitimate server exchanges with SolarWinds. At which point, if you were to look at a normal baseline, you would only see a slight variation and you would be uncertain. And worse, even if you got to the point where the second stage loaded and you detected it, you would still be uncertain of what occurred because they only infected machines that had very little monitoring capability. So it's very likely if you're a victim, you had less telemetry than would be needed to decisively determine that you were compromised. And if it gets to stage 3, they would compromise your authentication systems, allowing them to use your accounts without a proper logon, bypassing authentication, meaning that your logs were full of inconsistencies and would be even harder to determine what's going on. You would be left asking, is this just an anomaly or a malfunction? Or is this actually a compromise? So what do you do? Well, what you don't do is rush to the containment phase. You stay in the identification phase for a longer period. So, I think right now, 2 weeks ago, if you were asked to question, oh my God, are we breached? We have SolarWinds Orion. You might be tempted to dive into all of your security systems, into your logging systems, and look for the smoking gun. Have we been breached? But I'd like you to ask this question. So, what if you did find that? What decision does that enable you to make? Well, we found the DLL. We know we've been breached. So what decision will that allow you to make? Well, we're going to contain it. What in this case would the containment action be? If this is ransomware, you know what to do. If this were a virus, you know what to do. Reimage the laptop, reimage the server. If this were a piece of malware in a phishing email, you delete the email, you know what to do. Ask the user to change their password if they've been phished. Start monitoring their accounts, you know what to do. What would you do here? Because in this case, if it reached stage 3, your authentication is compromised, your Active Directory is compromised, your cloud global administrator may be compromised. The majority of your systems, remember, this is Orion, it contains privileged accounts used to manage your network infrastructure, your key applications, all of your servers. You can't simply change passwords and get better. You can't simply reformat Orion and reinstall it. You have to assume that there's a possibility that the threat actor is everywhere. And so you might say, what we'll do is we'll start checking everything. Well, I want you to realize that in this case, you're not going to be certain of anything. You're not going to be certain of the extent of the breach, whether it's total or partial, and that it's a major project in and of itself to determine that and create a course of action. So imagine this. You found out the DLL was on the Orion server, so you shut down the Orion server. Good. The backdoor might be the initial backdoor disabled, but you don't know at this point whether there's a secondary backdoor, because that's part of the modus operandi, is a secondary backdoor down at the bottom here. So you don't know that, and yet you have to start looking for it. And your boss says, is it taken care of? I need you to do this really quick. We don't know. Did they compromise your Active Directory? Maybe you could look for signs, and you might look, some of the advice out there says, go and look to see if there are additional accounts created on your servers. You might find some. Well, now this creates additional uncertainty. Is it just this one server, or is it all of them? Do we have backdoors that we can't detect because they're able to destroy our logs that we wouldn't know? They're able to disable our security products. We have to check so many things. So here's what you do. You start at the beginning and you say, what decision do we need to make? Well, the first decision you need to make is, has stage 1 been installed? And there are some very clear indicators for that. You are not, if you find it, you are not moving to containment yet. If you find this, you're now going to try to determine whether it has been activated, and accept the fact that you may not be 100% confident. So your goal isn't just to determine whether the backdoor is activated, but to establish a confidence rating. Do you have low confidence? Do you have medium confidence? Do you have high confidence? Why? So your goal here is to make an assertion. Has it been activated? Has it not been activated? And to find evidence that would support that assertion with confidence. Now, go and look at your data sources and inventory them. So how do you know whether this backdoor has been activated? Well, you look for DNS records, DNS history that looks like this. It's the same for all the victims. Now, here's the tricky part. If you've got these DNS records, you just say, well, how far back? Do we have a month of them? Do we have 3 months of them? Do we have 6 months of them? And that is your confidence in the assertion we've been breached or not breached. If you've got records all the way back to March and you didn't see this, good for you. You can say with confidence, this was not activated. 100% confidence? No. But if you don't see it no one can say, I am confident you've been breached, because you don't have the evidence. Now, if you're in a tougher situation where you only have 3 months of these records, now maybe you only have moderate confidence, but at least you can give your bosses a really good explanation of where you're at, and you can move on. Now, if you don't have this data, you have no confidence in either assertion. And then you have to start digging deeper, but realize and communicate the expectation that this investigation is not going to be quick. You're going to be under pressure to give them answers that you cannot, but you can explain to them why you cannot and why you can't be confident. I get it. People aren't always rational. The board of directors isn't going to take that answer, but it is your best approach. Now, what do you do to fill in the gaps if you only have moderate confidence? Well, this is where intelligence comes in, because fortunately in this case, many people have done analysis of the malware. We know its behaviors. So you could, for instance, if you didn't have those DNS records, look at the list of all of the conditions by which the malware would deactivate. So you've already asserted that, yes, the malware was present. That was expected. I need to figure out if it's been activated. I need to know how confident I am. I don't have the logs. I'm not very confident. So now use the list of all the things that would cause it to deactivate. And if you have one of them, raises your confidence. This probably didn't run. And now what you do is you say, we're going to conclude the first phase of this and say, we have a reason to believe it didn't run. We don't have a lot of evidence, but it's more likely that it didn't run than it did. And now you're going to do a second phase of investigation that is focused on all the secondary indicators. Did the second phase drop? Can we find that indicator? If we didn't find that, we could start a third investigation saying, let's look very broadly, but let's expect. Now we have to search for so many things with such uncertainty, it will take time to weed out. And at this point, and this is one of the recommendations from CISA, is they say, well, what you need to do is try to use your network logs and look at every single one and determine if it's normal or not. And you can do this. Believe me, it's not hard. You can go through and basically aggregate all of the destinations that your Orion server connected to and look at all. You're going to be able to explain a ton of them right away. All the internal servers. That's not C2 traffic. Now all the external ones. The ones to SolarWinds, you don't care about. The ones to Microsoft, you don't care about. The ones to cloud hosting, you care about. And there should be very few of those. And then you start to explain them. Which ones might be normal? Now, you might not be able to explain all of them, but the sheer quantity of them and the nature of what those URLs look like and the destination where they went could allow you to raise your confidence to the assertion, I have been breached or not breached. And it just comes down to which assertion, breached or not breached, has the most evidence. Now, the painful part is this will not be done in an afternoon. It may not even take, maybe not even done in a week. But at each point, if you focus on drilling down from was it installed, was it activated, did it have stage 1 communication, did it have stage 2 installation, did it have anomalies, you will be able to paint a picture that is a clear, concise communication to your leaders of how much uncertainty you have so they can make a decision. That's the best we can do. There is a separate part of this, which is about containment. And even if you get to that moderate confidence, you probably want in parallel to start proactive containment actions, even though they're not perfect. And also know that your containment won't be done for a very long time. So you'll shut down the Orion server. You'll take a forensic image of it that you will analyze later, or hire someone to analyze later. You will gather up all your logs and export them so they're not lost. Think about this. You might be investigating this for 2 weeks. You have 30 days of logs. Well, if you don't back them up now, you're going to lose 2 weeks of them by the time you get to the point that you want to look at them. So you back all of that up. That's going to take a day. If you get my picture. This is not your normal incident response, and you shouldn't treat it as such. And you should go slow. You don't need to work 24/7 on this, because it's not going to be over tomorrow. All hands on deck isn't going to get you your goal. You want to focus on what decision can you make, what evidence do you need to trigger that decision, and then to take those actions. It's not a sprint, it's a marathon. Okay, that's all I've got to say. This is a new world that we live in, the world of high uncertainty incidents. And you know what? The biggest SOCs in the world deal with those all the time. And that's why there's a book out there from O'Reilly and Associates called Intelligence-Driven Incident Response. I thought that book wasn't that great until this occurred, and I was like, oh my God. They're not talking about the normal incidents. They're talking about the ones where we don't know the answer and how we drive it with analysis processes and not action-based processes. If you disagree with me, I really would love to hear your feedback. I can say definitively that this works and that many organizations are applying this methodology, and those organizations are done already, and their Christmas is not canceled. I can also say that you need telemetry. Doesn't matter what size you are. If you have an MSP, ask to see the logs. When I used to assess security for a living, I got a lot of MSPs fired because I would ask to see the logs and they did not exist. It's vital. All right, guys, you got any feedback for me?
No, dude, honestly, I love the approach. I think you're right. I know we talked about this briefly. I think it was last week, which is the reason why we were doing this live stream, because I said, you know what? There's just so much good information that we have, that we've learned, that collectively I feel like we should share with the community if we can. And that's why we're doing this live stream. So I think it was great. Great approach. Again, more food for thought than anything, right? I mean, this is one incident. Now, wait for the next incident to happen and see if the same rules apply, right? So.
Don't say next incident.
Come on, dude. You know what? I'm in the security industry. I already know there's another incident. Till the day I retire, I know that there's always going to be another incident. So,
I think that what I'm talking about, I'm not the only one who's come to these conclusions, and I've read a number of materials that other people are ahead on this. But what I'm talking about, I think, is the future of incident response. Kyle Hausen just asked a question: is this technically threat hunting, where you don't have high confidence and you work on a theory? I don't think this is threat hunting exactly, but it is a scientific approach. And there's definitely overlapping methodologies to this. What I'm talking about isn't hypothesis driven. It's technically what's called evidence assertion or assertion evidence model. I don't want to get academic on you. I'm a librarian, folks. I classify, I catalog. It's how I work. There's huge overlapping between threat hunting methodology and this intelligence-led incident response. And they're really they're so important to the future of our defenses.
Okay, well, I think with that, we should start to wrap this up here, Michael. I'm sure Jared's probably getting poked and prodded. Hey, can I get your attention? So I'll let Jared with final thoughts.
This has been a great discussion, actually, because I think this is probably one of many that are going to end up happening here. I am really interested in the technical Tuesday that you're looking to put together on this. And I think, unfortunately, as Moro was saying, I mean, I think this is like the first one that we know of to this extent. I think that's the, I think the fact that, like we're talking about, how we can move forward with this in the future. And, there's going to be different methodologies coming out. Michael, your approach, I really actually appreciate the approach, and the fact that you've had to saturate yourself with this for the last 2 weeks. I think the net benefit to us as a community is what you and your team have gone through, just surrounding this entire scenario. So while we could easily paint a very dark picture, I would like to think that we can take some some positive notes out of this, and then take that into the next phase of what we do for DevOps, SecOps, just general consulting best practices even. So thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. Moro, any final word from you?
So I was gonna say this much. 2020 has been a very exciting year. This breach has been, I think, a massive wake-up call. If not to the security community, who is probably expecting this, should be a wake-up call to everyone else, including, President Donald Trump. That's right. Security is not something you can just blindfold and wish it'll go away. But with that, I want to say, happy holidays to everyone. Yeah, Michael doesn't know this, but I'm trying to convince him to do one more live stream here, maybe before the end of the year.
Well,
just kind of either a fun topic, or maybe a recap of all the security incidents or something like that. So Michael doesn't know that that yet, but I'm going to try and convince him for one final live stream for 2020. But with that said, just want to wish everyone happy holidays. For those of you that have to work on this, I feel for you, but hopefully you'll get through it, and family will understand. But wishing everyone, a safe holidays. I get it. The situation's kind of pretty bad these days. So, but I want to send positive thoughts. So I'm wishing everybody happy, safe holidays.
So next Tuesday, there will be a Technical Tuesday live stream that will go into some of the technical depths, because I love geeking out on this, and I've read way too much analysis to put it away now. I also do have, we're near the end of the year, and I really want to put out some thanks to a lot of the people in our community. And I'm going to name a bunch of people who have been very active. And if I miss you, I'm sorry. So, first I want to thank Kyle Hausen, who in our community is probably the most technically advanced and puts the most lively additions to our topics, is a real leader. To Andrew and Chris and Alec, to our past guests, TJ and Emily, and oh my God, there's so many HR people, I can't remember all their names.
Well, Jared, Jared's on right now, but thank you.
Yes, to Jared,
Jessica,
to Doug and Debbie and Andrew, who are on our B-Sides panel, to the 10 people who were on our very first live stream ever, to Derek, to Adnan, to all the folks at the Calgary InfoSec Club, especially to Emily, Alex, Jeremy, and James on the executive. Your involvement has really given us a new angle, and actually, I think, really inspires us to do different things here. The being able to support students as well as new professionals there. Oh, and to Ryan, who literally has run all the Technical Tuesdays when I haven't had a chance, and to Neil. It's actually a couple Neils. There is just too many people to thank, and if I forgot you, I'm really sorry. But okay, this is the most egotistical thing I've ever done. I had intended for our New Year's party to have little pint glasses made up with our logo. And then I couldn't get them made up in time. So I went and had stickers made up, and they just came in today. And this is a dry run. So Moro, I'm really sorry. There's only my cartoon head, not your cartoon head. There will be a second batch.
Oh no, that's okay. I'm not that egotistical. In fact, I'd rather be the guy in the background doing nothing.
If you'd like a sticker, just DM me or email me, send me your mailing address, and you will get stickers. And you can put them on a pint glass, or you can put them on a mug that says "Not a Threat Model," like I did. So I will give you stickers. Now, to wrap, on New Year's Eve in our Discord, we're going to have a little party. We're going to play some games because, this whole thing started at the beginning of COVID where we couldn't get together and we couldn't party anymore. And that's certainly true. So why not to get together with some cybersecurity folks and just hang out on New Year's. That's what we're going to do. Until then, I just want to leave you with one message. And this is the message for 2021. It isn't just about telling someone whether you're breached or not. It's about telling them how confident you are in that and why. And that's what your boss wants to hear, is why or why not. He doesn't care if it's bad news. Bad news is coming either way. It's how confident you are in what you're going to do next and the decisions it supports. Thank you so much. And now I click the outro. It's been so long, I don't remember how to do that.